The most feared boss on the hill had never flinched at a bullet, a raid, or a rival's blade at his throat. Yet watching his full-figured private cook get ready for dinner with another man undid him before breakfast had even gone cold. Dorian Vale ruled an empire built on iron control, but tonight, for the first time in 4 years, another man was reaching for the one thing he had never let himself call his own. That single dinner reservation was about to cost a rival his best-laid plan, and cost Dorian the last of his composure. The Vale estate sat above the city on a ridge the locals called Marrow Hill, hidden behind black gates and a wall of old cypress that swallowed the street noise below. From a distance, it looked almost gentle, pale stone catching the morning light. Nobody who worked inside made that mistake twice. It was a fortress dressed in linen and candlelight, a place where men carried weapons under tailored wool and learned early that Dorian Vale's silence was more dangerous than his shouting. He was 37, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, with a stillness that seemed carved rather than practiced. For years that had been the whole of him, a locked door with a good tailor. Except for 4 years, something had been getting past the door anyway. It arrived every morning on the corner of his desk, a cup of coffee brewed dark enough to argue back, a bowl of oat porridge with cinnamon and a careful pinch of salt, exactly the way his stomach tolerated on the mornings his head ached worst. And underneath the spoon, folded small, a handwritten note. The first time it happened, Dorian had stared at the scrap of paper for a full minute, certain he should tell the woman who left it that he did not employ a nursemaid. He had not made that call. He had eaten every bite instead, and the next morning there had been another note, bolder than the first. He told himself he kept them out of habit. He did not tell anyone that he had a locked drawer where every single one was stacked in order, kept by hands that had also signed papers no honest man should sign. Mabel Quinn had no idea he kept them. She assumed he read them once, grunted, and let them go into the trash. She did not know that on the nights business turned ugly, Dorian sometimes unlocked that drawer and read one twice. Mabel was 29, full-figured, and she wore that fact the way some women wear a good coat, with no apology folded into it anywhere. She had soft arms that never stopped moving, dark curls that escaped whatever ribbon she tied them back with by noon, and a laugh that started low before it broke wide open when something actually earned it. Officially, she was the private cook. Unofficially, she was the reason half the house still remembered how to be human, tracking which men skipped breakfast, knowing which foods eased the migraines Dorian refused to admit he had. Dorian had watched his men straighten their spines when she crossed a room because she remembered every one of their names, watched the kitchen under her hands become the one place inside those walls where nobody pretended to be harder than they were. And he hated. In a low, simmering way, he refused to name exactly how much he had come to need it. New Mafia stories drop here every single day, so subscribe and don't miss one. That morning started wrong before the sun finished rising. The coffee sat on the desk. The porridge sat beside it. But Mabel was nowhere in the kitchen when Dorian passed through, and the note under the spoon was folded smaller than usual, tighter, as if whoever wrote it had needed both hands to keep from shaking. "Please eat everything today," it said. "I need to ask you something later, and I would rather do it once there is food in you, because you get impossible when you are hungry." Dorian read it once, then again, eyes narrowing in a way none of his men would have wanted to witness up close. By 7, the house already knew something had shifted. A guard dropped a ring of keys in the front hall, and Dorian looked at him with a cold so total the man went the color of the marble floor. Cassius Renner, his underboss and the only person alive who occasionally risked speaking to him plainly, walked into the study with a routine file, and left 3 minutes later looking entertained, which was never a promising sign. Mabel noticed all of it, of course. She stood at the long marble counter stirring a pot of stock, trying to gather whatever courage she had been losing since dawn. The kitchen was her kingdom, though she would never have called it that out loud. She wiped her hands on her apron the moment Dorian walked in. The room changed shape around him the way it always did. Dorian looked at no one but her. "You wanted to ask me something," he said. His voice stayed level, but Mabel had spent 4 years learning the difference between his business calm and his wounded calm, and there was a tightness at the corner of his mouth that told her which one this was. "Yes," she said, aiming for a smile and mostly landing it. "I did." He waited, standing there in his black suit, dark hair combed back, looking at her like she was a puzzle he intended to solve before lunch. "My cousin called last night," Mabel said, folding her flowery hands over her apron, suddenly far too aware of her own softness, the way her body always seemed to get louder whenever she was nervous. "She's been trying to set something up for me. A dinner with a man. His name is Julian Marsh. He deals in antiques and imports, or that's what she told me. It isn't serious, only dinner. I already started the braise for tonight, and Elena knows how long to leave it. I would just need to slip out a little early." The silence that followed was so complete even the stock on the stove seemed to simmer more quietly out of respect. Cassius had drifted into the doorway behind his boss and lifted one eyebrow, wisely saying nothing. Dorian looked at Mabel like she had set a loaded weapon on the counter between them. "A dinner with Julian Marsh. A man you don't know." "I know his name," she said, and regretted it the second his stare darkened. "My cousin says he's polite. Respectable. She thinks it would be good for me." "Good for you," Dorian said. There was no open anger in the words. That was worse than anger. His anger had always been most dangerous wearing a calm face. Mabel lifted her chin. "I haven't gone anywhere for myself in a long time. I love it here, you know that. But sometimes I feel like I only exist inside this kitchen and your medicine schedule. I wanted one evening where I could just be an ordinary woman going to dinner." Something moved behind Dorian's eyes, fast and deep, gone before anyone else could have named it. Mabel saw it anyway. She had learned him in small, careful pieces over 4 years. "You are not ordinary," he said. It should have felt like a kindness. Instead, it landed somewhere closer to grief. "I know," she said softly. "That's the problem." His jaw tightened. For one wild second, Mabel thought he might simply refuse. He had no real right to. But a man like Dorian rarely needed rights when he already had power, and he could have said the estate needed her, that it wasn't safe, and the conversation would have ended there. Instead, he checked the time on his phone and looked back up. "You may leave at 5. Mabel blinked. "I may?" "Yes." The permission should have brought relief. Instead, something in his face made her stomach twist quietly. "Thank you," she said, careful with it. Dorian gave one short nod, turned, and left the kitchen without touching the coffee she had already poured for him. The moment he was gone, the kitchen exhaled. Elena drifted to Mabel's side and murmured that sapphire blue would suit her tonight. Mabel tried to feel excited, telling herself Dorian had only been strange because he hated any break in his routine. Behind the closed door of his study, Dorian had stopped pretending to be calm at all. "Find him," he said. "Everything. Address, business records, bank activity, known associates, travel. If the man has ever lied about his favorite wine, I want to know by lunch. This is a security matter, I take it." Dorian looked up slowly, and the amusement faded, though not all the way. "She lives in this house. She works this house. She is close to my rooms, my food, my medicine, my men." "And your temper," Cassius said, "apparently closer than any of the rest of us." "Do the search." Cassius held his gaze a moment, then nodded and left. Alone, Dorian touched the note Mabel had left him without meaning to. He pictured her across from a stranger with candlelight and white cloth, a man making her laugh without knowing the exact way her eyes softened first, when something genuinely delighted her. The thought moved through him with a force sharp enough that he set the note down before his hand closed around it too tightly. This is not jealousy, he told himself. Jealousy was reckless and weak, a human failing he had spent years cutting out of himself. This was discipline. This was protection. Mabel moved through a dangerous house with more trust than anyone else inside it, and trust was always the door an enemy wanted open. By noon, Cassius returned with a thin folder and a colder face. At first glance, Julian Marsh is clean, he said, setting it on the desk. No arrests, no debts that matter. Import license 2 years old, pays his taxes, smiles in the right charity photographs. And at second glance, he's a ghost wearing very good shoes. Cassius opened the folder. No school record before 2 years ago, no childhood address that holds up. His passport was rushed through a clerk we already know takes money on the side. His import company receives quiet payments through 3 shell accounts, and 1 traces back to a warehouse owned by Anton Cray. Dorian's face did not change, which was exactly how Cassius knew the name had landed where it needed to. Cray had spent years trying to find a way inside the Vale estate, buying guards, planting drivers, pressuring a doctor who had quietly vanished not long after. Every attempt had been found and burned. Mabel was different. She did not move through the house like a soldier or a banker who could be bribed. She moved through it like comfort itself, and people trusted comfort without ever asking it for identification. Dorian rose from his chair. We let the door open. Then we see exactly who tries to walk through it. And Mabel? For one instant, something cracked all the way through Dorian's control, a flicker in his eyes that was dark and violent, and underneath all of it, afraid. No one touches her. At 5 that evening, Mabel stood in her small room staring into the mirror at a woman she almost didn't recognize. Elena had been right about the sapphire blue. The dress moved over her curves instead of fighting them, and for once she didn't reach for a cardigan to cover herself. She looked beautiful, and the thought startled her enough that tears nearly rose to meet it. Not thin. Not the kind of woman men chased across a party with easy confidence, but full and warm and undeniably present. Downstairs, Dorian watched from the shadowed curve of the staircase as she crossed the entrance hall. Dark curls pinned with a sapphire ribbon, just enough color on her lips to make him notice the soft shape of her mouth, and hate in advance every man who might notice it after him. For 4 years, he had known her only in aprons and flower dust. The sight of her dressed for somebody else struck something old and possessive in him he had no clean name for. She looked up and saw him. Neither spoke for a moment. "You look," Dorian began, and the word beautiful rose in his chest and lodged there, trapped behind pride and fear and a lifetime spent refusing to say anything that could be used against him. "Be careful," he said instead. Something small shifted in Mabel's face, a disappointment most people would have missed. Dorian did not miss it. She smiled anyway. "I always am," she said, and walked out toward the waiting car, toward Julian Marsh, toward a trap built out of loneliness and soft compliments. Dorian waited until the car disappeared past the gates before he moved. Cassius stepped out of the shadows. "We have people on the restaurant, the street, and the kitchen entrance. Marsh arrived 10 minutes ago. Cray's people haven't shown yet. They will. And if this really is only a dinner, then I will owe her an apology." Cassius gave a short, humorless laugh. "That might be the most dangerous thing you've said all day." Dorian didn't answer. He was already walking toward the garage, coat moving behind him like something alive. Enemies had spent years hunting for the weak seam in his empire. None had understood the truth. Dorian Vale's one true weakness wasn't hidden in a vault. She was sitting in the back of a black car in a sapphire dress, hoping one ordinary evening might make her feel wanted, and if Julian Marsh had been sent to use that hope as a weapon against her, then by morning the city would understand exactly what happened to men who mistook Mabel Quinn's kindness for an open door. The car carried her through the iron gates and down the winding road, and for the first time in years, Mabel did not look back. She wanted to pretend, just this once, that she was only a woman in a blue dress on her way to dinner with a man who might smile when he saw her. The restaurant Julian had chosen sat inside an old building near the river. Golden lamps glowing in the windows, white tablecloths too expensive to risk staining. Julian stood the moment he saw her, handsome in a polished, careful way, a smile rehearsed enough to feel safe. "Mabel," he said, taking her hand lightly, "you look beautiful." The compliment landed soft, but it made something inside her tremble. She had been called useful, reliable, a wonderful cook. Beautiful was a word she had stopped waiting for a long time ago. For a while, the dinner felt almost ordinary, which was the dangerous part. Julian asked about her cooking, and she told him about standing on a stool in her mother's kitchen as a girl, both small hands wrapped around a wooden spoon. He laughed in the right places. He never once let his eyes drift over her body the cruel way some men did. For a few unguarded minutes, she felt like she had finally stepped into the kind of evening other women got to have without thinking twice about it. Across the street, behind the tinted glass of a parked car, Dorian watched her smile and felt something ugly twist behind his ribs. Cassius sat beside him holding a tablet that showed the restaurant floor through 3 hacked cameras. Julian leaned in just enough to look interested without looking hungry. Dorian hated him for the control of it. Honest men eventually gave themselves away. Liars measured every single breath. "She looks happy," Cassius said carefully. Dorian didn't answer. "She also looks safe, for the moment." For the moment isn't enough. Inside, Julian ordered wine and asked what it was like working somewhere like the Vale estate. A man like Dorian Vale must be demanding, mustn't he? Did he keep strange hours? Did he still take his breakfast alone in the study every morning? Mabel's fingers tightened around her fork before she noticed she'd done it. Outside, Dorian saw the change in her face before Cassius did. His body went completely still. "There," he said. "He pushed too soon," Cassius murmured, watching the feed. Inside, Mabel kept her voice light. "I'd really rather not talk about my employer." "Of course," Julian said almost too gently. "Forgive me. Your cousin told me you cook for a powerful family. I only wondered how lonely it must be standing that close to a world that never quite lets you all the way in." That was clever, too clever. It found a soft bruise and pressed directly on it. "I'm not lonely there," Mabel said, though the words came out thinner than she wanted. "No? A woman like you shouldn't be hidden away in a kitchen, Mabel. You should be taken places, admired, asked what you want, not only what someone else needs from you." For one dangerous second, she wanted to believe him, not because Julian mattered, but because the words themselves did. That afternoon, Dorian had looked at her in the sapphire dress and only told her to be careful, when some part of her had wanted him to say something else entirely. If his jealousy already has your heart racing, subscribe and stay for what happens next. "I think I should go," Mabel said, setting down her fork. Julian's smile didn't disappear. It only cooled a few degrees. "Before dessert, I ordered something special." A waiter approached with a small white plate, a delicate cinnamon pear tart dusted with sugar, candied walnuts scattered over honey glaze. Beautiful. Too beautiful. Compliments of the house. Mabel stared at it. Cinnamon, pear, honey, walnut. Every one of her favorites. The exact things a person could only know if they had watched her far too closely. Her stomach went cold. Across the street, Cassius's phone buzzed. He read the message, and the calm dropped off his face. The waiter, false name, came in through the service entrance 20 minutes ago. He's one of Cray's. Dorian was already opening the car door. "Dorian." Cassius's warning came too late to matter. Inside, Julian picked up the dessert spoon and held it toward her. "One bite, then I'll stop asking questions." Mabel didn't take it. Behind her, the waiter shifted his weight, barely a movement, almost nothing at all. But she had spent 4 years walking past armed men, and she knew exactly when a room changed shape without warning. "Julian," she said, voice quiet. "Who are you?" For the first time all evening, his smile looked entirely real. "Someone who hoped you'd make this easier." The spoon never reached her hand. The restaurant doors burst open hard enough to turn every head in the room. Dorian Vale stepped inside in a black coat dark with rain, his face calm the way winter is calm right before it kills the ground. 2 of his men followed, and Cassius came in fast through the side entrance. The waiter's hand jerked toward his jacket, but Dorian was faster. He crossed the room in 3 strides and swept the dessert plate off the table so hard it shattered against the wall. Mabel gasped and stood, her chair scraping back. Julian rose too, but Dorian's fist closed around the front of his shirt and drove him back against the table before he could speak a word. "Julian Marsh," Dorian said, voice low enough that nearby diners leaned away rather than risk hearing more. "That name insults anyone with a memory." Julian's face hardened, the polished softness gone. "You followed her. You drugged her." "Not yet." The words had barely left his mouth before Dorian hit him. The sound cracked through the room, sharp and final. Diners screamed, chairs scraped back, and the waiter tried to bolt for the service door only for Cassius to catch him and twist his arm behind his back. 2 men rose from separate tables reaching under their jackets, only to find Dorian's security already standing behind them. Mabel stood frozen, one hand pressed to her chest, trying to understand how a quiet dinner had turned into a room full of drawn weapons. Dorian moved in front of her without looking back, putting his body between hers and every visible threat in the room. It should have comforted her. It didn't, because the truth hit her with the same force as fear. He had known. He had followed her here. He had turned her evening into a trap without ever once telling her she was walking into one. Julian laughed, blood shining at the corner of his mouth. "There it is. Cray was right. The cook is the door. Not because she knows your numbers or your men. Because she makes you careless." Dorian didn't deny it. The silence that followed was worse than any confession could have been. Julian's voice turned crueler still. "You should feel honored. We watched that estate for years. Guards, suppliers, cousins, none got close enough. Then there was sweet Mabel, with her little notes and warm hands. Everyone trusts the woman who feeds them, and he trusts you most of all." Mabel's eyes filled, though she refused to let a single tear fall. Dorian's hand curled into a fist. "Take him." His men moved in. Julian didn't fight, only smiled as Cassius dragged him out. "Kill the messenger if it helps you sleep," he called over his shoulder. But everybody knows now. Dorian Vale has a heart, and tonight it's wearing sapphire blue. The room went silent. Dorian turned to Mabel at last, and all the violence drained out of his face so suddenly, she almost wished it had stayed. Violence she understood. Tenderness from him, she did not. "Mabel." She stepped back. The small motion hit him harder than any blade could have. "You knew," she whispered. His eyes darkened with something close to pain. "I suspected. I had to protect you." "No." Her voice didn't shake this time. "You had to control the situation. There's a difference. You let me walk in here believing this was my choice. You let me sit across from a man you were already investigating. You watched me almost eat poison, and you said nothing. I would never have let him hurt you. But you let me feel foolish." Her voice cracked, and the hurt inside it did more damage than anger ever could. "You let me hope, Dorian, and you never once trusted me enough to just tell me the truth." He looked like a man who wanted to reach for her and didn't know whether his hands had earned the right anymore. "You're coming home." Mabel shook her head. "No, I'm not. I'm going to my aunt's diner. Alone." If you send men after me, I will never forgive you. Dorian had built his entire life on refusing impossible terms. Standing there with a shattered dessert on the floor and tears in her eyes, he understood, with a strange and quiet terror, that forcing this one would be the fastest way to lose her completely. He turned to Cassius. "Bring a car around. No escort inside, no visible tail." Mabel gave a small, sad laugh. "Visible? I'm tired of being protected like I'm too soft to survive my own life. I know exactly what danger sounds like when it walks across marble floors. I didn't need you to make decisions around me. I needed you to talk to me." Then she walked away through the ruined restaurant, past the men with guns still drawn, and Dorian stayed exactly where he was until the door swung shut behind her. For the first time in years, Cassius watched his boss look truly, completely lost. The days that followed were quiet in a way the estate had never once been. Business continued. Cray pulled his people back after Julian's capture, whether from fear or strategy, nobody could say. Nothing collapsed. But the house felt ruined all the same. The kitchen still produced meals, but no one lingered in it. The morning tray still appeared on Dorian's desk each day, coffee, porridge, 3 pills folded in a napkin, but the coffee was never quite bitter enough, and there was no note beneath the spoon. Dorian took the pills. He left the food mostly untouched. On the third morning, Cassius walked into the study and found him staring at a blank sheet of paper. "You're going to frighten the staff if you keep refusing to eat." "I frighten the staff by breathing." "True, but Mabel made it seem almost charming." Cassius paused. "She's safe at her aunt's diner. 2 men 2 blocks away, exactly as you ordered. She hasn't left except to buy groceries and walk the block." "Does she ask about the estate?" "No." "Does she ask about you?" The silence answered for him. That night, Dorian walked into the kitchen alone. The room sat dark except for the small light above the stove, and without Mabel in it, it felt like a stage after the actors had gone home. Then he saw it, half hidden behind a stack of folded towels on the low shelf near the window. A worn brown notebook. He picked it up carefully. Her recipe book was soft at the corners, stained with oil and chocolate, some pages holding measurements, others notes scrawled sideways in the margins. Less pepper for Cassius when his stomach acts up. Soup for the men who pretend they don't need soup. He turned the pages, then found his own name. For D, oat porridge, bitter mornings, more honey if he looks tired but refuses to admit it. He stopped breathing for a moment. Don't let him skip the pills. He thinks no one notices when his hand presses against his chest after long meetings. I notice. Coffee darker on the nights he hasn't slept. He carries the whole house like a punishment. I wish somebody would take care of him without making him feel weak for needing it. Dorian sat down at the kitchen table with the notebook still open in his hands. No blade in the dark had ever reached through his armor as cleanly as a stack of grease-stained recipe pages. Mabel had never loved him loudly. She had simply watched him with patient eyes and quietly fed every part of him he had spent years trying to starve into silence. For 4 years, she had told him the truth in meals and notes. For 4 years, he had answered her only with silence. At dawn, the estate woke to the smell of something burning. Elena found Dorian in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled up, his hair less perfect than usual, staring down at a pot of oat porridge like it had personally betrayed him. The mixture inside was thick, grayish, and smoking faintly at the edges. "Boss," Elena said carefully, "what exactly are you doing?" "Cooking, for Mabel. She said I made decisions around her instead of with her." "That may count for something." Elena tasted a spoonful and instantly regretted it. Maybe don't let her eat much of it. An hour later, Dorian arrived at the Bluebird Diner with no guards beside him, none visible anywhere. He wore a plain dark coat instead of a suit jacket, and in his hands he carried a covered bowl inside a paper bag that looked far too ordinary for a man like him to be holding. The diner was small and warm, red stools lining the counter, old family photographs crowding the walls. Mabel was wiping down a table near the back when she saw him, and her hand went completely still. Aunt Dolores behind the counter took one long look at Dorian and calmly disappeared into the kitchen, though not before giving him the exact kind of stare only an aunt could aim at a feared criminal and live to tell the story. Mabel straightened slowly. She wore a plain gray dress and no apron, her curls loose today, and she looked tired in a way that made something in Dorian's chest ache. "I asked you not to come with power behind you," she said. "I came alone. My men are 2 blocks away. I'm trying to be honest, not stupid." Despite herself, Mabel almost smiled. "What's in the bag?" "An apology," Dorian said. "I attempted porridge. For you. And for every morning I ate yours without ever once saying thank you. That smells burnt. It's also too salty." The softness on her face shook him worse than any anger would have. She gestured toward the booth, and he sat, leaving the table between them like a border neither of them had decided how to cross yet. He lifted the lid. It looked even worse in daylight than it had in his kitchen. Mabel stared at it, and then began to laugh, quietly at first, then all the way open, and Dorian sat there helplessly, his chest aching in a way he had no defense against. "It looks like punishment," she said. "It tastes worse. I lost confidence halfway through and tried to fix it with more salt." She laughed again, then set the spoon down, the laughter fading and leaving the hurt exposed underneath it. "Why are you here?" Dorian folded his hands on the table. He had commanded rooms full of armed men without a flicker of hesitation, but the truth in front of him now felt heavier than any weapon he had ever carried. "When you left, the estate didn't fall apart. My men still obeyed, my enemies still stayed afraid, but it stopped feeling like a home. It just went back to being a fortress." Her eyes shone, but she said nothing yet. "I told myself I followed you for security. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I was afraid he would actually see you, really see you, the way I've been seeing you for years and refusing to say out loud." His voice dropped lower. "I knew how you took your coffee. I knew you hummed while you kneaded bread. I knew you gave extra portions to the men who were grieving and pretended they weren't. I knew every note you ever left me. I kept every single one." Her eyes lifted fast. "You kept them. In my desk. Locked. All of them." Mabel blinked hard and one tear slipped free. "I fell for you quietly," Dorian said. "Through meals and notes and the way you looked at me like there was still something worth feeding underneath everything I've done. And because I'm a coward in exactly the places that matter most, I turned that into control instead of honesty. I thought if I protected you from every possible danger, I'd never have to risk actually asking you to choose me." She wiped her cheek. "I don't need a boss, Dorian. I don't need a cage. I don't need a man who follows me because he can't stand not owning every room I walk into." The words hurt, but he accepted every one of them. "I know." "Then what do you think I need?" "A man brave enough to tell you the truth before danger drags it out of him," Dorian said. "A man who trusts you with the ugly parts and lets you decide for yourself whether to stay. A man who understands your kindness was never weakness, and your softness was never permission." Mabel studied him a long moment. "And can you actually be that man?" "I don't know how yet," he said honestly. "But I'll learn, if you let me." The diner hummed quietly around them. Rain tapped lightly against the front glass. Mabel looked down at the ruined porridge between them, then back up at the man who had made it with hands trained for violence instead of tenderness. "You really kept every note? Everyone? I thought you threw them away." "I tried once. I took it back out of the trash before anyone saw me do it." Mabel covered her mouth, and this time the tears arrived along with the smile. Dorian reached across the table slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't. His fingers closed gently around hers. "I'm still angry," she whispered. "You should be." "I'm still hurt. I know." And if I come back, it won't be to hide in your kitchen while you decide what's best for me from somewhere I can't see." "No," he said, his thumb moving softly over her knuckles. "If you come back, it will be because you chose it. And you'll stand wherever you want to stand. Beside me. Away from me. In the kitchen, in the garden, in the middle of a room full of people who will know exactly who you are." Mabel held his gaze. "And who am I, Dorian?" He answered without a beat of hesitation. "Mabel Quinn. The woman who turned my house into a home before I was ever wise enough to deserve it." Neither of them moved for a while. Then Mabel sighed. "We need to teach you how to cook. And how to talk to me before you launch a full surveillance operation. That one might take longer." She laughed, and the sound loosened something deep inside his chest that had been locked shut for years. When she stood, he stood too. She came around the table slowly, in no hurry, not surrendering, not pretending the night at the restaurant hadn't happened, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, right over the heart he had spent half his life pretending he didn't have. "You scared me," she said. "I scared myself." "Good," she whispered. "Remember that." Then she rose onto her toes, and Dorian bent to meet her. The kiss wasn't a conquest, and it wasn't a claim staged for frightened strangers. It was quieter than that, and warmer, a promise still learning how to stand on its own 2 feet. His hands settled carefully at her waist, holding rather than taking, and Mabel let herself lean into him a full breath longer than pride would have allowed a year ago. Months passed before the city ever saw them together in public. Rumors had already started, the way rumors always find their way through locked doors. People whispered that Dorian Vale had changed, not softened exactly, since his enemies still feared him, and his men still obeyed him faster than they could breathe. But the estate itself felt different. Mabel came and went as she pleased, cooking some days, reading in Dorian's study on others, arguing with him behind closed doors on the rest. And the staff quietly learned that the only person brave enough to tell Dorian Vale he was being ridiculous was a full-figured woman with flower on her sleeve and Haz and love written plainly across her face. He still kept guards, still checked the exits the second he entered any room. But he told her the truth now, even the ugly parts, especially the ugly parts. Mabel never made his world safer than it actually was. She made it honest. The hospital fundraiser came the following spring, a grand ballroom under the Vale family name, full of white flowers and people smiling carefully because they knew half the city's future got decided between champagne glasses. Then Mabel stepped in beside Dorian. She wore deep emerald that night, richer than the sapphire dress from the evening everything had first cracked open, the fabric moving over her curves with a quiet, unhurried confidence. A small pin shaped like a basil leaf caught the light near her heart. She wasn't hiding behind an apron anymore, and when the room turned to look at her, she didn't shrink from a single second of it. A reporter stepped forward, holding out a recorder. "Mr. Vale, can you tell us who's joining you tonight?" The old Dorian would have let silence answer for him, but Mabel had not walked back into his life just to be hidden behind one more wall. He turned toward the cameras. "This is Mabel Quinn," he said, his voice carrying clean and steady across the ballroom. "She's the woman who taught me that power means absolutely nothing if there's no one waiting who makes you actually want to come home." The room went still. Mabel looked up at him, and for once in his life, Dorian didn't hide a single thing. Not the devotion, not the pride, not the soft, dangerous truth that had once made him furious, simply because he couldn't control it. A camera flashed, then another. Mabel smiled, not because the world had finally granted her permission to be seen, but because she no longer needed anyone's permission to be visible at all. By the end of the night, donations had broken every record the hospital had ever posted. Cassius stood near the back wall, watching his boss track Mabel with his eyes every time she crossed the room, and shook his head, smiling to himself. The city still feared Dorian Vale. But somewhere inside the estate on the hill, something stronger than fear had finally taken root and stayed there. Subscribe now, because a new Mafia story just like theirs lands here every single day. The gates still locked at dusk. The guards still walked the walls. But every morning now there was coffee on the desk, oat porridge warm beside it, and medicine waiting on a folded napkin, and more often than not, a note tucked beneath the spoon. Sometimes Mabel left it first. Sometimes Dorian did. "Eat before you frighten someone," hers would say. "I am trying," his would answer. And somewhere between the bitter coffee, the burnt lessons, and the truth they had both finally learned how to speak out loud, the coldest house on the hill became warm enough at last to be called a home.